The Godfather opens in darkness. A man sits across from Don Vito Corleone and says he believes in America. He trusted the courts. He trusted the police. They failed him, so now he is here. In a dimly lit office, while a wedding plays outside, he asks a crime boss for justice. That opening is fiction. But the man who inspired Don Corleone's voice, Frank Costello, the actual boss of what would become the Genovese crime family, had already sat before a real Senate committee in 1951 with 20 million Americans watching, his face hidden from cameras, his hands visibly shaking on live television as he refused to answer questions about how many politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials were connected to him. The film got the atmosphere right. It got the suits, the wedding, the way these men talked. What it left out is the part that actually mattered. Over the next sections, here is what the documented record actually shows. Section 1. The film. The real organized crime helped make. Before a single frame of The Godfather was shot, the real people it was based on tried to stop it from being made. In 1970, a man named Joe Colombo stood outside the FBI headquarters in New York City with 30 protesters. He was not there as a crime boss. He was there as the founder of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a group he had just created that claimed its mission was fighting discrimination against Italian Americans. Within a year, that organization had roughly 40,000 dues-paying members across multiple states. It held a Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle that drew an estimated 50,000 people. Several members of Congress showed up. Frank Sinatra headlined a benefit concert for the group at Madison Square Garden. Joe Colombo was also the sitting boss of one of the 5 most powerful crime families in New York. When Paramount Pictures announced it was adapting Mario Puzo's novel into a film, Colombo and his league immediately targeted the production. The problem, in their stated view, was the word itself, Mafia. Colombo's organization had already pressured the U.S. Justice Department into ordering the FBI and other federal agencies to stop using the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra in their official press releases and reports. Now they wanted the same result from Hollywood. The tactics were not subtle. Producer Albert Ruddy began receiving threatening phone calls. Notes were left making clear that the production was unwanted. The Los Angeles Police Department warned Ruddy he was being followed and that he needed to switch cars to throw off the people tracking him. Equipment was vandalized. Unions were pressured to create production delays. Location owners who had agreed to let the crew film on their properties suddenly backed out. The film had originally been planned under the working title The Mafia. That title disappeared quickly. Ruddy eventually requested a sit-down with Colombo and his son Anthony. They met in early 1971. Colombo handed over a list of demands. Ruddy agreed to the core of them. Every mention of Mafia and Cosa Nostra would be removed from the script entirely. The League would receive the proceeds from the film's premiere. League members would be given jobs and parts in the production. Ruddy would also secure premiere tickets for them and hold the premiere in New York. A public announcement was made in March 1971, stating that The Godfather had the blessing of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Executives at Gulf and Western, Paramount's parent company, were furious when they found out Ruddy had essentially made a formal agreement with an organized crime figure. Ruddy was briefly fired, only after pressure from director Francis Ford Coppola, and, according to multiple accounts, from the mob itself, was he reinstated. The agreement held. The words Mafia and Cosa Nostra do not appear once in the final film. The character of Luca Brasi, the terrifying enforcer who opens the movie sitting nervously in the Corleone household, was played by a man named Lenny Montana. Montana was a real enforcer for the Colombo crime family. He had never acted before. He was cast as a direct result of the negotiations. He was so nervous on set with Marlon Brando that director Coppola simply rolled the camera during what Montana thought was a rehearsal, then later wrote Montana's obvious nervousness into the script as part of the character. The deal also reached further up. According to Al Ruddy, the true power behind the agreement was not Colombo, but Russell Bufalino, a senior figure in the Pennsylvania crime world with influence over the commission. In Ruddy's telling, Colombo was consulting Bufalino throughout the negotiations. When Bufalino gave the approval, Colombo gave it. Without that chain of approval, the production would not have moved forward in New York. On June 28, 1971, while Coppola was 4 blocks away shooting scenes of fictional organized crime figures being taken down, Joe Colombo walked to the podium at his 2nd annual Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle. A man named Jerome Johnson, carrying press credentials and a camera in one hand, stepped close to the stage and fired 3 times. Colombo was hit in the head. Johnson was immediately shot and eliminated by an unknown person in the crowd, who disappeared along with a woman who had arrived with Johnson. Neither was ever identified. Colombo never regained full consciousness. He died 7 years later from the lasting physical effects of his injuries. The League collapsed shortly after the shooting. The Godfather was released in March 1972 and became the highest-grossing film in history up to that point. The real organized crime figures who had shaped its script loved it. As one account describes it, for the people in that world, the film became something close to scripture, a version of their own lives that was cleaner, more honorable, and more romantic than anything they had actually built. The man who had negotiated its existence never saw it. What the film became is one of the most celebrated works in cinema history. What it was not, and what the next section gets into, is an honest portrait of the men it was built from. The real bosses who inspired Don Corleone were composite figures drawn from some of the most ruthless operators in American history. And the gap between the screen version and the documented record is wider than most people know. Section 2. Don Corleone was a composite, and the real versions were worse. Marlon Brando did not invent Don Vito Corleone from nothing. He studied a real person. In 1951, the U.S. Senate held televised hearings into organized crime across America. The hearings were so widely watched that schools closed so children could go home to see them. Blood banks ran short on donations because clinics installed televisions to attract donors who then stayed to watch instead of leaving. One estimate puts the audience at more than 20 million Americans, one of the largest ever for a congressional event at that point in history. The star witness was a man named Frank Costello. He was 60 years old, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and he ran what had been Lucky Luciano's crime family as its acting boss. Costello had a deep, raspy voice that came from a botched throat operation that had removed polyps from his vocal cords. He sat at the witness table in New York, refused to let cameras show his face, and so the television audience saw only his hands, fidgeting, clenching, rubbing against each other as the questions got harder. He answered very little. When a senator asked what he had done for his country, Costello shot back, "Paid my taxes." The audience laughed. Costello walked out without being dismissed and was later cited for contempt. 2 decades after those hearings, Marlon Brando sat down and watched footage of Costello testifying. He took Costello's specific raspy voice and used it as the foundation for Don Vito Corleone. He took Costello's composed manner under pressure, his preference for quiet authority over public displays of force, his reputation for preferring negotiation to conflict. The fictional Godfather's voice, mannerisms, and general bearing came directly from a real organized crime boss on live television. Costello was known throughout the organized crime world as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He did not earn that nickname through violence. He earned it through political connections so deep that he had allegedly helped certain attorneys obtain judge positions in New York City. He moved in circles that included politicians, celebrities, and businessmen. He golfed at clubs, dined at fine restaurants, and kept an apartment overlooking Central Park. He called himself a legitimate businessman. Federal authorities, including FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who personally designated him a top threat, disagreed. But Costello was only one of 3 real men who went into building Don Corleone. A man named Joe Profaci supplied the olive oil business. Profaci had come to the United States from Sicily in 1921, and by 1925 had set up an olive oil importing operation in Brooklyn. As demand for olive oil grew after World War II, his company became one of the largest importers in America. He was nicknamed the Olive Oil King. By 1930, he was simultaneously running protection rackets, loan sharking, and other illegal operations out of the same Brooklyn base. The Godfather's Vito Corleone runs the Genco Pura Olive Oil Company as his legitimate front. That detail came directly from Profaci's real life. The companies Profaci built, some of which sold under brand names still sold in supermarkets today, were the public face of a criminal operation he ran for over 30 years as the founding boss of what is now the Colombo crime family. A third figure, Carlo Gambino, contributed the quality of quiet, almost invisible power. Gambino ran the Gambino crime family from 1957 until his death of natural causes in 1976. He earned the nicknames the Godfather, the King of the United States Underworld, and the Dictator of New York City. He was described by law enforcement as the most powerful figure in American organized crime during his peak years. Despite all of that, he maintained an extremely low public profile, avoided the press, dressed plainly, and refused to live ostentatiously. He was the model for the idea of a boss who moves through the world as if he does not exist. So Don Vito Corleone, as audiences know him, the voice, the calmness, the olive oil business, the invisible authority, was assembled from pieces of at least 3 real men. The scene in The Godfather where Michael takes his boss to lunch at a restaurant and then steps away before the boss is eliminated was not invented by Mario Puzo. On April 15, 1931, Lucky Luciano invited his own boss, Joe Masseria, to lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant on Coney Island in Brooklyn. After they ate and were playing cards, Luciano excused himself to use the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 men entered the restaurant and opened fire on Masseria. The hitmen were Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel. No witnesses came forward. Luciano had a solid alibi. No one was ever convicted. Luciano then made peace with the rival boss he had secretly been working with, Salvatore Maranzano, only to have Maranzano eliminated 5 months later as well. Luciano reorganized the entire New York criminal world, created the commission, and positioned himself as the most powerful figure in it. He did this by eliminating both sides of a war he was supposed to be fighting on one side of. The Godfather presents this type of move as something Michael Corleone was reluctant to make, driven to it by circumstances, shaped by grief and necessity. Luciano was 34 years old when he arranged those 2 eliminations and restructured organized crime in New York. He was not reluctant about any of it. The composite that became Don Corleone softened every one of these men considerably. Costello's extensive political corruption became the Don's more dignified network of favors. Profaci's iron-fisted and widely hated leadership style, his own men revolted against him in the late 1950s over money, became Vito's warmth and generosity. The calculated ambition of Luciano became Michael's reluctance. What audiences fell in love with was a version of real people that had been cleaned up enough to be admired. The actual record of those men is a different story, and the gap between the two gets wider the more closely you look. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The film's most famous moral claim, that the Corleone family refused to enter the narcotics trade as a matter of principle, turns out to be one of the biggest gaps between the movie and the history it was drawn from. And what actually happened in that part of the story is a direct line between organized crime and the destruction of entire American cities. Section 3. The Enforcement Arm, the Killing Machine. The film never showed. The Godfather treats organized contract eliminations as rare, heavy decisions. The commission debates them. Bosses agonize over them. The act of ordering one carries enormous moral and political weight in the film. There is a reason for that. It is a deliberate, creative choice to make the audience feel the gravity of each one. But the real organized crime world in America during the same era ran something entirely different. A standing, salaried squad of professional contract killers that operated like a business. It was called Murder Incorporated. From 1929 to 1941, Murder Incorporated functioned as the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, the broader governing body that included both the Italian-American crime families and Jewish organized crime groups in New York. Its job was simple: carry out contract eliminations for any syndicate boss anywhere in the country on request. The killers were drawn mainly from poor Jewish and Italian neighborhoods in Brooklyn, specifically Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill. Their base of operations was Midnight Roses, a candy store at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenue in Brooklyn. That was the office. The organization was headed jointly by Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke, and Albert Anastasia. Buchalter ran the labor racketeering side and provided overall leadership. Anastasia served as what prosecutors later called the Lord High Executioner, the man who coordinated the actual operations. Prosecutors estimated the group was responsible for between 400 and 1,000 contract eliminations over its 12 years of operation. The killers were paid a regular weekly salary as a retainer. They were on staff. On top of that, they received a fee per job averaging between $1,000 and $5,000 per contract. Their families also received financial benefits. If a member was arrested, the organization provided the best lawyers available for their defense. It was structured like employment. There were regular workers, supervisors, and clients. The clients were crime bosses across the United States who needed someone eliminated without the job being traceable back to them. The way it worked was deliberate. A boss in Detroit or Kansas City or Philadelphia who needed someone removed would contact the syndicate. The syndicate would send a killer from New York, someone unknown to local police, unconnected to any local rivalry, with no visible reason to be in that city. The job would be done. The killer would return to Brooklyn. Because the killer had no known relationship to the target, investigators rarely had anything to go on. This system let mob bosses order eliminations while remaining several steps removed from the act itself. Harry Strauss was the most prolific member of the group. He went by the nickname Pittsburgh Phil, despite having no connection to Pittsburgh. He was arrested 18 times before ever being convicted of anything. By the time investigators caught up with him, prosecutors had solid evidence linking him to at least 28 confirmed jobs in New York alone. Law enforcement from Connecticut to California identified him in a similar number of cases in their own jurisdictions. Historians who have studied Murder, Inc. in depth put his confirmed total at well over 100. He was executed in Sing Sing's electric chair in June 1941. Strauss did not carry a weapon when traveling to a job. He would scout the location first and use whatever was available at the scene. He packed a briefcase when traveling out of town that contained only a change of clothes. The method of the job depended on what was at hand. The entire operation came apart because of one man, Abe Relis, known inside the organization as Kid Twist. Relis had been arrested 42 times by the age of 34. In early 1940, facing a murder charge he could not escape, he agreed to cooperate with Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer. What Relis provided was extraordinary. He had a near photographic memory and had been a senior member of the group for years. He gave investigators detailed accounts of roughly 70 specific eliminations. His information led law enforcement to previously undiscovered bodies and produced enough evidence to send multiple members of the organization to the electric chair. Relis had one more target left: Albert Anastasia. The case against Anastasia was the biggest one. Relis could place him directly in connection to the elimination of a man named Morris Diamond, a Teamster official, in a way that no other witness could. For the duration of his cooperation, Relis was kept under police protection at the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island. He had his own room on the 6th floor. 6 police officers guarded him around the clock across 3 rotating shifts. By some accounts, the total protective detail across the year he spent there numbered 18 officers at various points. On the morning of November 12, 1941, a few hours before he was scheduled to testify against Anastasia, Relis's body was found on a 2nd-floor roof extension below his window. A makeshift line of knotted bedsheets and wire was found tied to a radiator inside his room. Investigators concluded the wire knot had come undone while he was attempting to lower himself to the floor below. The official ruling was accidental death during an escape attempt. Almost no one believed it. Relis had shown no desire to escape. He was frightened of being unprotected, not eager to leave it. A grand jury that investigated a decade later in 1951 criticized nearly every aspect of how the security operation had been managed that night. No single officer was ever clearly in charge. Evidence was handled poorly, and the timeline of events had significant gaps. 5 officers on duty that night were demoted. Lucky Luciano later claimed that $50,000 had been paid to the police guards to make it happen. A 2005 investigation reported evidence suggesting that at least one of Relis's bodyguards was directly involved. No one was ever charged. Anastasia was never brought to trial for the diamond elimination. The case collapsed without Relis. Buchalter was not so fortunate. He was convicted on murder charges, and on March 4, 1944, he was executed in Sing Sing's electric chair alongside 2 associates, Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone. Buchalter became the only major organized crime boss in American history to be put to death by the state for his crimes. The Godfather is a story about a family trying to hold power together. Murder, Inc. was a corporation that charged fees, paid salaries, managed logistics, and eliminated problems on request. The film barely acknowledges it exists. The next section gets into something else the film sanitized even more thoroughly: what organized crime was actually doing to the cities around it while bosses sat in their offices talking about loyalty and respect. Section 4. The Drug Myth. The Godfather's most consequential lie. One of the most memorable moments in The Godfather is when Don Vito Corleone sits across from a narcotics trafficker named Sollozzo and refuses to enter the drug trade. He calls it a dirty business. He draws a moral line. The entire plot of the film spins out from that single refusal. The attempt on his life, the war between families, Michael's transformation. It is the moral backbone of the story. It is also built on a fiction so complete that the real bosses who inspired the character were, in documented historical fact, some of the biggest narcotics traffickers in American history. Lucky Luciano, the man whose organizational genius created the commission and the modern structure of organized crime, was arrested for transporting narcotics as far back as his early criminal career. After being released from prison and deported to Italy in 1946,
he moved to Naples and immediately resumed coordinating narcotics shipments into the United States. The trafficking he organized from Italy contributed directly to the heroin epidemic that would hit American cities throughout the 1950s. Vito Genovese, the boss the Genovese crime family is named after, and one of the most powerful figures in organized crime during the 1950s, was convicted of narcotics trafficking in 1959 and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He ran the family from his prison cell until he died there in 1969. The man who sat at the very top of the real version of the world The Godfather depicts was taken down specifically for dealing in the trade the film says mob bosses avoided on principle. The film's narcotics storyline was loosely based on real debates within the commission about how visible the drug trade should be, not whether to be in it, but how carefully to manage the exposure. According to a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Crime and Justice by the University of Chicago Press, the Lucchese and Bonanno families were specifically identified in the French Connection case as dominant importers of heroin from France into New York City during the 1950s. The Bonanno family's narcotics involvement was so extensive that in the 1980s, a separate federal prosecution, known as the Pizza Connection case, proved an international trafficking network with over 200 participants, coordinated primarily by the Bonanno family and a Sicilian crime group. Defendants used pizzerias as storefronts while running heroin from Sicily to the United States. The scale of what the real families were doing to American cities was enormous. During the 1950s and 1960s, New York City held between 4 and 5% of the total U.S. population. In those same years, between 43 and 50% of all addicts listed in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Registry were New York City residents. The city was not just a market, it was the distribution center. Harlem was the epicenter. Most of those being addicted in the earliest waves were young men from Black and Latino communities, people who had no connection to the organized crime families supplying the product and no recourse when it consumed them. The Mafia kept its own neighborhoods relatively protected while the supply flowed elsewhere. By the 1960s, New York's 5 Italian-American crime families and associated figures had maintained a grip on narcotics wholesale in Harlem specifically. Independent dealers who wanted to access the supply had to go through them or through their distribution networks. The French Connection, the supply chain running from opium fields in Turkey through processing facilities in Marseille, France, and then into New York, was the primary source. By the 1950s and 1960s, according to a 2014 DEA museum lecture by federal drug enforcement officials, more than 80% of the heroin consumed in the United States came through that system, and the American Mafia was the primary buyer at the wholesale end. The Godfather's Don Corleone eventually does allow a controlled narcotics trade at the end of the first film, as a compromise to end the war between families. Even in fiction, the refusal does not hold. In reality, it never existed in the first place. The bosses who inspired the character were already running the trade before the film's story even begins. The myth that the mob avoided narcotics out of moral principle was one the mob itself worked hard to promote. It made them look more honorable. It gave politicians and the public a version of organized crime that was easier to process, ruthless in some ways, but not responsible for the addiction destroying entire city blocks. The Godfather took that myth, made it the emotional engine of the film's entire plot, and sent it into the culture permanently. What the drug trade actually did to the communities around it is not something the film spends time on. And the next section, covering how organized crime kept its silence for decades, shows exactly why so much of the real damage stayed hidden for so long. Section 5. The French Connection. Global narcotics at industrial scale. The Godfather is a story about one family in one city. The real narcotics operation that the actual organized crime families were running during the same era was something else entirely, an intercontinental supply chain spanning 3 continents that flooded American cities with heroin for decades. It was called the French Connection. The operation started in the 1930s, reached its peak in the 1960s, and was not dismantled until the early 1970s. At its peak, it was responsible for supplying between 80 and 90% of all the heroin consumed in the United States. The route moved in stages. Opium poppies were legally grown in Turkey by farmers licensed to supply pharmaceutical companies, but a significant portion of that supply was diverted to criminal markets. That raw material traveled through Syria and Lebanon, where it was converted into morphine base. The morphine base was then shipped to clandestine laboratories hidden in the suburbs of Marseille in southern France, operated by Corsican organized crime networks. In those labs, it was processed into finished heroin, reportedly at a purity of up to 98%. From Marseille, it was smuggled into the United States, primarily through New York. The American side of the operation was managed by the Italian-American crime families. The Corsicans in France were the processors and exporters. The New York families were the buyers, importers, and distributors. According to research documented by the DEA and peer-reviewed academic sources, the route Turkey to Marseille to New York was structured and formalized in the early 1950s, directly by Lucky Luciano, operating from his base in Italy after his deportation from the United States. In October 1957, a series of meetings took place at the Grand Hotel et d'Epargne in Palermo, Sicily. The attendees included senior figures from both the American and Sicilian sides of organized crime. Joseph Bonanno, head of the Bonanno crime family in New York, led the American delegation. Also present was Lucky Luciano, Bonanno underboss Carmine Galante, and multiple senior Sicilian crime figures. The FBI believed it was these meetings that formally established the Bonanno family's deep involvement in the narcotics trade going forward. Italian prosecutors later indicted 17 people connected to the meetings for criminal conspiracy and narcotics trafficking. Every defendant was acquitted due to lack of direct evidence. But many of the same individuals were later convicted of doing exactly what they had been accused of planning. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics estimated in its 1960 annual report that between 2,600 and 5,000 pounds of heroin were entering the United States from France every single year. By 1969, the network was supplying 80 to 90% of the country's heroin, according to French government officials and U.S. narcotics authorities. The shrimp boat Caprice d'Étang, seized by French authorities in February 1972 as it left Marseille heading toward Miami, was found to be carrying 915 pounds of heroin. In a single 14-month period starting in February 1972, French and American drug enforcement agents dismantled 6 major heroin laboratories operating in the suburbs of Marseille. The New York end of the distribution was no less elaborate. Detectives from the NYPD Narcotics Bureau, following a tip in 1961, began surveilling a small diner in Brooklyn run by a man named Pasquale Fuca. Fuca was a mob-connected figure whose uncle was a key negotiator between the New York side and the French suppliers. Months of surveillance revealed the operation. Cash was exchanged at the diner to pay for heroin shipments coming in from Marseille, sometimes concealed in the door panels of large American cars shipped across the Atlantic on ocean liners. One French television personality named Jacques Angelvin was unwittingly used as a courier. Heroin was packed into his 1960 Buick, which he sailed over on a liner, believing it contained jewelry. That case became the real-life basis for the 1971 film The French Connection. The Pizza Connection came later and was even larger in scope. After the French Connection was dismantled, the pipeline was rebuilt using Sicily as the processing hub rather than France. By the late 1970s, the Bonanno family and a network of Sicilian crime groups were importing heroin through a front operation built around pizzerias across the United States. In 1984, federal prosecutors charged over 200 participants in what became known as the Pizza Connection trial. The defendants used their food businesses to receive and distribute narcotics while laundering the proceeds through Swiss bank accounts. Prosecutors documented that Sicilian suppliers were selling heroin to the American side at $50,000 per kilogram, which was then resold for $130,000. The Sicilian families were earning an estimated $35 million per year from the arrangement. Their American counterparts were earning roughly $90 million per year. All of this, from Turkey to France to Brooklyn, and later from Sicily to pizzerias across the country, was happening in the same era that The Godfather depicts organized crime as a world where the most powerful boss draws a moral line at narcotics. The narcotics supply chain was one part of how organized crime shaped the world around it. But the way the real families kept all of this hidden for so long, and what happened when the silence finally broke, is a story about a completely different kind of power, one the film portrays as noble and the historical record shows was anything but. Section 6. The Real Omerta. How the Code of Silence was actually enforced. The Godfather presents the Code of Silence as something close to a sacred tradition. Men bound by loyalty and honor who choose, as a matter of personal dignity, never to talk to outsiders about the business. The film makes it look like a culture. The historical record shows it was something enforced through fear, and, when fear failed, through consequences that went far beyond the individual who broke it. The code is called Omerta. Its core rule is straightforward. Under no circumstances do you cooperate with law enforcement, speak about criminal activities to anyone outside the organization, or acknowledge that the organization even exists. This applied regardless of whether the information involved allies or enemies. Even if someone was personally wronged, Omerta required that grievances be settled inside the organization, not through any legal system. For decades, it worked. Law enforcement agencies across the country knew that organized crime families were operating, knew roughly what they were doing, and frequently knew who the leadership was. They simply could not get anyone to testify about it. Witnesses disappeared before trials. Jurors in neighborhoods under mob influence were too afraid to convict. Cases collapsed repeatedly, not for lack of knowledge, but for lack of anyone willing to say what they knew on the stand. Then, in October 1963, a 59-year-old soldier from the Genovese crime family named Joseph Valachi sat down in front of the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and did what no made member of the American organized crime world had ever done before. He acknowledged the organization existed. He described its structure. He named its leaders. He described its rituals. He explained what it called itself, Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. Valachi had been serving a 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking when he became convinced the Genovese family boss, Vito Genovese, had given him what was called a kiss of death, a signal that a contract had been placed on his life. In the prison yard at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, he attacked and beat to death an inmate he believed was the assigned person. He was wrong. The man had no connection to the mob. Facing the death penalty for the killing, Valachi made a deal. He would tell the government everything he knew. His testimony ran to thousands of pages. He named the bosses of virtually every significant organized crime family in the country, many of whom had been completely unknown to the public until that moment. He described the commission, the induction ceremony, the hierarchy of boss, underboss, capos, and soldiers. He provided information that helped investigators solve dozens of previously unsolved cases. Senate Committee Chairman John McClellan called it, in a formal statement, the biggest single intelligence breakthrough in the history of combating organized crime in the United States. Attorney General Robert Kennedy said the same. Valachi's physical testimony never led directly to prosecutions of senior leadership. His knowledge was limited by his rank, and much of what he described fell outside the statute of limitations. But the ripple effect was enormous. Congress passed laws enabling court-ordered wiretaps. The Federal Witness Protection Program was established in 1970, giving future informants a way to cooperate without being certain they would be targeted for it. The RICO Act, also passed in 1970, allowed prosecutors to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individuals, meaning a boss could be charged for crimes carried out by people working under him. All three of these tools were direct responses to what Valachi had made visible. The next major crack came in November 1991. Salvatore Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family and the right-hand man of boss John Gotti, agreed to testify for the government. He did so after FBI wiretaps of the Gambino family headquarters in Little Italy captured Gotti speaking disparagingly about Gravano and appearing to position him as a target for future prosecution. Gravano decided the loyalty only worked one way. He confessed to involvement in 19 separate criminal incidents, including homicides involving his best friend, Louis Melito, and his own brother-in-law. He testified for 9 days, implicating 29 mobsters in total. Gotti was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole in April 1992. He died of cancer in prison in 2002. Gravano, in exchange for his cooperation, served less than 1 year of a 5-year sentence before entering the Witness Protection Program. His former FBI handler later said that Gravano's information arguably helped lead to the demise of organized crime in New York as it had existed for decades. Whether that assessment is too broad is debatable, but what is not debatable is that the man who had been the number 2 figure in what was then the most powerful crime family in the country had walked into a federal courtroom and told everything he knew in exchange for his freedom. The Godfather's version of this code as something men choose to maintain because they believe in it. The documented history shows it survived as long as it did because the cost of breaking it was designed to be higher than any benefit anyone could imagine receiving by speaking. When that calculation changed, when prison sentences grew long enough, when protection became real enough, the silence broke. Not because the code stopped being sacred, but because the men inside it were human, and humans respond to incentives. Quote 2. What the Code of Silence protected for most of the 20th century was not just the mob's secrets. It protected the mob's reach into the systems supposed to stop it, into law enforcement, courts, and government. That part of the history is where The Godfather most underestimates what it was describing. Section 7. Labor Racketeering, the Invisible Empire. The Godfather is a film about power. Who has it, who wants it, and what it costs to hold on to it. But the way the real organized crime families exercised their deepest and most durable power barely appears in the film at all. There are no scenes set in union halls, no boardrooms where mob figures dictate which companies get contracts, no pension funds being drained while workers believe their retirement savings are safe. That entire dimension of the real story, the one that touched the most ordinary Americans and lasted the longest, is almost completely absent from the Godfather universe. What the real 5 families built was not primarily a network of mob bosses in dark rooms making violent decisions. It was a massive economic operation embedded inside American industry, sustained through decades of control over organized labor. The organized crime families got their foothold in labor unions during the 1920s and 1930s. The entry point was straightforward. Both employers and unions were using outside muscle to settle labor disputes, and the mob was available. Once they were inside, they consolidated. According to a peer-reviewed study published by the University of Chicago Press in the journal Crime and Justice, the Cosa Nostra crime families obtained their hold on the unions during that era and used it to amass wealth and power that defined the rest of the century. Labor racketeering, the study concludes, was a major source of the crime families' power and wealth from the 1930s onward, and the history of American organized crime cannot be properly written without it. In New York City, the five families controlled unions across the construction, garment, garbage collection, trucking, and restaurant industries. The mechanism was always roughly the same. Put loyal people in leadership positions inside the union, then use that control to extort employers, skim dues and pension funds, dictate which businesses got contracts, and deliver political support to politicians who stayed out of the way.
Employers in affected industries quickly learned that paying what the mob asked for was cheaper than enduring a work stoppage. Many companies simply budgeted for it as an operating cost. The Teamsters Union became the most visible example. At its peak, it had over 2 million members working across trucking, warehousing, food distribution, and construction. Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa, who rose to leadership in the 1950s, built a working relationship with organized crime that gave the mob access to something worth more than any cash payment: the Central States Pension Fund. This fund collected dues from Teamster members across the country to provide their retirement security. By the late 1950s, Hoffa was directing that money into loans to Las Vegas casino developers, many of whom were fronts for or outright associates of organized crime families from New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, and Milwaukee. The numbers were staggering. By 1976, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund had made approximately $272 million in loans to Las Vegas casinos and related Nevada real estate. The Mob Museum in Las Vegas estimates that federal officials believe mobsters skimmed approximately $300 million in cash from the casinos funded by those loans. The skimming works simply. Cash was taken out of counting rooms before it was officially recorded, then delivered to organized crime bosses across the country in suitcases. The workers whose pension contributions had built that fund never saw any of it. Some of them were threatened when they tried to collect what they were owed. According to documented reporting, one retired truck driver attempting to claim his pension was told by a union local employee that if he persisted, he could end up in a ditch. An hour after he went home, an anonymous caller told him he could be eliminated for $1,000 and a plane ticket. Hoffa was convicted of pension fund fraud and jury tampering in the 1960s and went to prison in 1967. He received a pardon from President Richard Nixon in 1971, with a condition that he not run for Teamster office again until at least 1980. In 1975, Hoffa disappeared. He was last seen in a parking lot outside a restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, heading to what he believed was a meeting with two organized crime figures. He was never found. His disappearance has never officially been solved. The construction industry in New York was another arena where the mob's labor control made itself felt in concrete terms. Sammy Gravano, the Gambino underboss who later cooperated with the government, testified in open federal court that he had total control of Teamsters Local 282 in New York. In his words, he controlled the president, the vice president, the secretary-treasurer, delegates, and foremen. If he wanted a specific person working as a foreman, he told the local leadership, and it happened. According to a 1983 Department of Labor report to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, there were approximately 85 labor organizations in the Chicago area alone that were suspected of being associated with, influenced by, or controlled by organized crime.
Chicago was not unique. The Godfather shows organized crime as something that operates alongside legitimate society, violent and corrupt, but separate. The labor racketeering record shows something different. For decades, the real mob was not operating alongside legitimate society. In key industries, it was legitimate society running the unions, directing the construction contracts, financing the casinos, and deciding who got work and who did not. What the families built in the unions was durable because it was hidden inside institutions people trusted. The political corruption that made all of it sustainable was even more hidden, and far more damaging than anything the film acknowledged. Section 8. Political corruption. The power. The film only glimpsed The Godfather acknowledges that organized crime has political reach. There is a senator in the film who ends up compromised. The family has judges and officials who owe them favors. But the way the movie presents it, a few key relationships managed carefully, used sparingly, dramatically understates what was actually happening in the real world the film was drawing from. The real mob's political reach was not a collection of useful contacts. In some cases, it was the political system itself. Frank Costello, the man whose voice Marlon Brando studied to build Don Corleone, spent decades operating as the effective power behind Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that controlled New York City politics for most of the first half of the 20th century. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, Costello intervened in Tammany's internal decisions, helped select candidates, and collected loyalty from politicians and judges he had assisted along the way. Among those documented by the Senate Kefauver Committee as connected to Costello was William O. Dwyer, who served 2 terms as mayor of New York City in the 1940s. During the 1951 hearings, the committee questioned O'Dwyer directly about meetings with Costello. O'Dwyer acknowledged the meetings, but disputed the nature of them. He resigned as mayor under the pressure of the investigation and was appointed U.S. ambassador to Mexico, a move widely viewed as a political exit designed to prevent further scrutiny. The Kefauver hearings, held across 14 American cities between 1950 and 1951, were the first major public reckoning with how deeply organized crime had penetrated legitimate political and law enforcement structures. When the committee reached New York, it had already amassed evidence across the country that organized crime controlled large numbers of politicians and police officers. More than 20 million Americans watched portions of the New York hearings on television. It was one of the largest audiences for any live broadcast up to that point. Restaurants reported lost business. Department stores extended their hours to accommodate shoppers who had stayed home to watch. What people were watching was confirmation that the boundaries between organized crime and elected government were far thinner than most had assumed. Costello himself testified at the hearings. He refused to allow his face to be filmed, so the television cameras fixed on his hands instead, fidgeting, clenching, rubbing against each other as the questioning got harder. The New York Times recorded the details. He admitted to being on close personal terms with Tammany Hall leaders in 10 of the city's 16 political districts. He insisted he never discussed politics with any of them. His testimony was widely disbelieved. He was ultimately convicted of contempt of the Senate and tax evasion, serving approximately 14 months in federal custody. The political corruption documented by the FBI decades later was even more systematic. Operation Greylord, an FBI undercover investigation running through the mid-1980s in Chicago, resulted in the conviction of 92 individuals, including judges, lawyers, police officers, and court officials. The Brylab investigation, which began in Los Angeles in 1979, documented how the mob was directly bribing government officials to steer lucrative insurance contracts to mob-connected businesses. These were not isolated incidents. They were standard operating procedure across major American cities for decades.
The most decisive moment of reckoning came in 1985 when U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani indicted 11 organized crime figures, including the sitting bosses of all 5 New York families. The case was called the Mafia Commission Trial. Using the RICO Act and evidence gathered through 171 court-authorized wiretaps and bugs placed inside homes, social clubs, cars, and restaurants, prosecutors built a case that the commission itself, the governing body of organized crime, was a criminal enterprise. Over 200 FBI agents worked the investigation across 5 years. When the verdict came in November 1986, 8 defendants were convicted. 7 of them received 100-year prison sentences on January 13, 1987. 6 of those 7 died in prison. According to an FBI memo later revealed publicly, the leaders of the 5 families voted in late 1986 on whether to arrange the elimination of Giuliani himself. The heads of the Lucchese, Bonanno, and Genovese families rejected the proposal. Colombo boss Carmine Persico and Gambino boss John Gotti supported it. The proposal was not carried out. Separately, Sicilian Mafia leader Salvatore Riina had placed a contract worth $800,000 on Giuliani during his first year as mayor of New York in 1994. The Godfather's Senator Geary is compromised in a hotel room. A single man, a single moment of blackmail, a single political relationship managed as a business transaction. The documented history of organized crime's political infiltration was structural, persistent, and deep enough that it took one of the largest law enforcement operations in American history to begin dismantling it. And even then, several of the bosses sentenced to 100 years in 1987 continued running their families from inside federal prisons for years afterward. __quote_3__. The corruption the film shows is a shadow of what actually existed. But even that shadow, in the historical record, looks tame compared to what organized crime's money did to the physical infrastructure of entire American cities. Construction contracts, public works projects, and billions in mob-taxed materials that generations of ordinary people paid for without knowing it. Section 9. What the Godfather left out, and why it still matters. The Godfather was released on March 15, 1972. By the time it left theaters, it had become the highest-grossing film in history up to that point. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest films ever made. On Rotten Tomatoes today, it carries a 97% critic score and a 98% audience score. None of that is in dispute. What is also not in dispute is what the film chose not to show. Francis Ford Coppola himself, in a 2003 documentary, described The Godfather as a classic Shakespearean tale about a king and his 3 sons. Producer Robert Evans said the film was meant as a metaphor for capitalism. Neither of those framings has much room for the actual content of what the real 5 families were doing to the cities around them. The film's entire moral universe is built around the Corleone family, their decisions, their loyalties, their losses. As film critic Roger Ebert noted at the time, the film contains almost no scenes depicting ordinary citizens who are on the receiving end of what the Corleone family actually does. We never see the neighborhoods. We never see who pays. That choice is what made The Godfather the film it is. And it is also what made it one of the most consequential pieces of mythology the 20th century produced about organized crime. Selwyn Rabb, a veteran New York Times organized crime correspondent whose book, 5 Families, is one of the most extensively researched accounts of the real mob, documented what federal law enforcement witnessed after The Godfather's release. According to Rabb, FBI and local investigators on surveillance duty observed made men and associates across New York imitating the mannerisms and language they had seen in the film. They played the film's musical score at parties and weddings as though it were their own anthem.
The film did not just reflect the world these men lived in, it gave them a version of that world they preferred to inhabit. Sammy Gravano, who is admitted to involvement in 19 homicides and served as underboss of the Gambino family before turning government witness, said he saw the film as a young man entering organized crime and took it as confirmation that he was on the right path. The feedback loop between the film and the actual world it depicted became fully circular within years of the film's release. Real mobsters started dressing differently, speaking differently, presenting themselves to the world in ways shaped by what they had seen on screen.
A former Pennsylvania police officer was quoted saying that in every mob figure's home he ever searched as part of a raid, he found a prized copy of the Godfather films. Younger members of organized crime began treating the film less as entertainment and more as a set of instructions. The strangest evidence of the film's lasting power came in 2025, when Italian authorities conducting a major operation against the Sicilian Cosa Nostra released details from wiretapped conversations between senior organized crime figures. In one intercepted conversation, an alleged mob leader named Giancarlo Romano complained about the low quality of new recruits. He told a young associate to study the film. His exact recorded words, "If you watch The Godfather, the connections he had, he was very influential because of the power that he built at a political level." Romano then described the current state of the organization. "We used to be number one. Now it is others. We are on our knees." Italian authorities conducting that operation served 183 arrest warrants across Sicily as part of a coordinated crackdown. Sicilian prosecutors noted that despite decades of pressure, Cosa Nostra continues to attempt reorganization. The issue is not that The Godfather is a bad film. It is a masterpiece of filmmaking in almost every technical and artistic sense. The issue is what it omitted, and what that omission cost the public understanding of organized crime for generations. The film shows no heroin entering Harlem, no pension fund being drained, no construction contract inflated by a hidden mob tax built into every bid. No judge placed on a payroll. No worker threatened in a parking lot for asking about his own retirement savings. No neighborhood hollowed out over a decade while a supply chain ran from Turkey through France to a candy store in Brooklyn. The Godfather shows power exercised with elegance and regret. The documented record shows power exercised through supply chains, bribery networks, and the systematic exploitation of every institution ordinary people depend on. The film made the mob romantic enough that real criminals used it as a training manual, and real bosses recommended it to their recruits decades after its release. The actual history of what those same organizations did to American cities over the same period tells a completely different story. One measured not in dramatic scenes of consequence, but in overdoses, stolen retirements, compromised courts, and structures built with skimmed money on public land. Both stories come from the same source material. The Godfather chose which one to tell. Section 10. The Verdict. What the record actually shows. The Godfather became the highest-grossing film in history when it was released in March 1972. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Over 50 years later, it holds a 97% critics score and a 98% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Virtually no serious film discussion excludes it from lists of the greatest movies ever made. None of that is the argument here. The argument is simpler. The film made an artistic choice to tell the story of organized crime from inside the family looking outward. It humanized its characters. It gave them dignity, weight, and moral complexity. And in doing so, it left out almost the entire account
of what those same organizations actually did to the country around them. Salvatore Gravano, the Gambino underboss who later admitted to involvement in 19 homicides and whose testimony brought down John Gotti, saw the film as a young man entering organized crime. He said he floated out of the theater. He said the film made their life seem honorable. He said he would use lines from it in real conversations. He said the wedding scene, the music, the whole atmosphere, it was real. He meant that as a compliment. What it also reveals is exactly the problem. A film built on research and fiction had successfully constructed a version of organized crime so convincing that the actual participants in that world adopted it as their mirror. Selwyn Rabb, the longtime New York Times organized crime reporter whose book, 5 Families, stands as one of the most rigorously documented accounts of the real mob, described what FBI and local investigators observed on surveillance operations in the years after The Godfather's release. Made men and associates played the film's musical score at their own parties and weddings. They imitated the mannerisms and speech of the characters. According to Rabb's documented reporting, the film validated their lifestyles and their decision to join the organization and accept its logic. A former Pennsylvania police officer stated that in every mob figure's home he searched during a raid, he found a prized copy of the Godfather films. In February 2025, Italian police released details from wiretapped conversations captured during a major anti-Cosa Nostra operation in Sicily. In one recording, an alleged mob leader named Giancarlo Romano told a younger associate to watch The Godfather. His reason? To learn from a fictional character how to build real political connections. He held up the film as an instruction manual. This happened more than 50 years after the film's release. The 183 arrest warrants served in that operation targeted members of the Cosa Nostra for crimes including extortion, narcotics trafficking, and organized crime association. The gap between the film and the record it was drawn from is wide enough to matter. The film's Don Corleone refuses to enter the narcotics trade on moral grounds. The real men who inspired him, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, members of the Bonanno and Lucchese families, built the French Connection and the Pizza Connection, supply chains that put heroin into American cities at industrial scale for decades. Between 1950 and 1965, New York City contained roughly 4 to 5% of the United States population, but accounted for between 43 and 50% of all addicts in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Registry. The film's world has almost no connection to that reality. The film's organized crime figures run a business that is violent but contained, operating in a world where most civilians are invisible. The real 5 families controlled construction contracts, garbage collection, the garment industry, trucking, and waterfront labor across the nation's largest city for decades. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, retirement savings collected from millions of working American truck drivers, was used to extend approximately $240 million in loans to Las Vegas casinos with organized crime connections by 1977. Federal officials estimated that mobsters skimmed roughly $300 million from those same casinos. The workers whose dues built that fund mostly never saw the money. The film's code of silence is a matter of honor. The historical code of silence was enforced through the credible threat of elimination, applied not just to the individual who talked, but sometimes to their family. It held long enough to allow the organized crime families to run their operations for roughly 4 decades with almost no prosecutorial success. When it broke, through Joe Valachi in 1963, through Sammy Gravano in 1991, through dozens of others between, it broke because individuals calculated that the personal cost of silence had finally exceeded the personal cost of cooperation. The film depicts the Commission,
the governing body of organized crime, as an almost diplomatic institution, settling disputes between families with measured authority. The 1985 Mafia Commission trial revealed it as something closer to a criminal board of directors coordinating extortion, labor racketeering, and contract approvals across the 5 families simultaneously. 8 of the 11 defendants were convicted. 7 received 100-year sentences. 6 of those 7 died in federal custody. The film shows no construction projects with hidden mob taxes built into every bid. No court case that collapsed because all witnesses recanted before testifying. No union election outcome decided by the family that controlled the local.
No neighborhood where a man was told that if he kept asking about his pension, he could end up in a ditch. These things are in the documented record. They are not in the film. None of this makes The Godfather a lesser work of cinema. What it makes is a work of cinema that performed a very specific kind of selection, choosing which parts of the story to tell and which to leave entirely off-screen. The parts it left out happen to be the parts that most directly affected the most people. The real mafia wars were not more dramatic than The Godfather shows. They were more mundane, more systematic, and far more expensive, measured not in dramatic confrontations between powerful men, but in stolen wages, flooded neighborhoods, compromised courts, and supply chains that ran heroin through candy stores in Brooklyn while the bosses sat across town discussing loyalty and respect. The Godfather told one true story beautifully.
The other true story, the one about what those same organizations actually cost, is still waiting for its film. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.